Good evening, everyone. How are you all? I am well, thank you. So tutorial questions should be posted on Canvas. So let me have a look if it has actually been published. So it is actually has been published on Canvas. So if you go to Canvas, go to this course under modules. So click the links to the modules, and then under week 2, you should be able to find the tutorial for this week. Let me know if you cannot find it. I am well, thank you. So, all right. So first thing first, as you come in, if you can go to this link and capture your attendance, that will be much appreciated. So log into that link using your unique key and password, and then find your name, and then click the checkbox next to your name to indicate that you are attending the tutorial today. Okay, so I hope everyone is doing well and keeping yourself safe and secure. Welcome back again to tutorial week 2 of Comp9120 database management system. So for this week, we are going to learn on entity relationship diagram. So there are a couple of exercises that we will do today. The first one is to analyze an ER diagram that is given to us. And the ER diagram is about a real estate company. It's actually a use case about real estate company. So in that ER diagram, we will be asked to find mistakes or errors based on the given scenarios or story that we are given. Okay, so we're given a story, a short story, or about a real estate company, and based on this story, we will need to find or identify any mistakes or errors in the model. Yes, so Fang Chao, yes, just click the green checkbox to capture your attendance. And for those of you who just arrived, you can actually go to that link to capture your attendance. All right, so let's go back to the tutorial again. So today we will be learning entity relationship diagrams. A couple of exercises. So the first exercise is to analyze an ER diagram that is provided to us. And based on the story given to us, we will need to identify mistakes or errors in the model, in the ER diagram. Okay. So this scenario is about a real estate company. So, and based on that story, if you go to the second page, you can see there is an ER diagram here. Let me just rotate this ER diagram. Okay. Okay, so if you look at this, so this is an ER diagram. So our task for exercise 1 is to identify errors or mistakes in this ER model. I'll give you to have a quick read, maybe a couple of minutes to read through the scenario. And then we'll then have a look into this model. And based on the scenario, our task is to then identify any mistakes or any errors in this model. So basically, if there is any gap, it could be that, for example, it's missing attributes or it's using incorrect primary key, perhaps, or maybe the constraint is wrong. So basically, any mistakes that you can identify in this ER model. So that's basically what we want to do for the first task. All right, I'll give you a quiet moment for a minute or two to have a read first, and then we'll have a look into this ER model. Okay. Okay, so let's have a read again together. So consider a scenario where there is a real estate company, and this real estate company manages rental properties. So each property will have an address, number of bedrooms, bathrooms, and car space. And then a rental property may have a number of rental agreements. So what is a rental agreement? A rental agreement details the weekly rent that is agreed upon with one or more tenants for a property for a period of time. And for each tenant, the details need to be recorded, include first name, last name, and date of birth. So at any point of time, each staff member must be responsible for managing at least one property, where a property can be managed by multiple staff members and must be managed by at least one staff member. at any point in time. The staff member have first name, last name, and date of birth. So a property is owned by one or more landlords. The ownership of its property may also change over time. Okay, so that is the real estate company scenario that we are given. And let's have a look at this ER diagram. So based on the story, what can you see as a mistake? Can you spot any mistake based on the use case that we are given? A tongue twister. What is a tongue twister? Is it like a food or some kind of food or something? Too much information. Okay, so a few of you looks like have suggested something. Maybe the line between property and has. Property and has. Okay, so let's have a look at property and has. So property and has. Any problem with between property? So this line here. Is there any problem with this line? So in this case, property has, so this is a thin line, right? So what does a thin line mean? Can anyone tell me what a thin line means? Yeah, so in this case, a thin line means a property has 0 or more. So basically more, or 0 or more, that means many, right? So 0 or many rent agreements. So a property has 0 or more rent agreements. Is that correct? Yeah, no problem with that, right? So a property can have 0 agreement, but at the same time, it can also have many agreements, many rental agreements. So that's possible, right? For a property to have many rental agreement, at the same time, it's also possible for a property to have 0 agreement, which means that there is no tenant. It may not have been tenanted yet. It may be a new property, for example. And I think the scenario didn't actually mention about a property can have 0 or more rental agreements. Obviously, it can be rented multiple times, which means that by different tenants, which means that it could have many rental agreements. In other cases, maybe a property may have 0 rental agreement. So that's not a problem. So someone else suggested something else. Car space is missing under property. Okay. So do you think that is correct? Car space is missing. So if you look at property here, a property has a number of member attributes such as property ID, the address, bedroom number, and bathroom number. So do we see car space number as missing in this case? Yes, that's correct. So if you read through the second sentence, it says that each property has an address, a number of bedrooms. So it has an address, it has number of bedrooms, and a number of bathrooms, and also car spaces. So in this case, we can see that the car spaces is not there. So it is missing. So that's actually the first mistake we spot. Okay. So let's add that. So let's add that car space number. curly space, okay. And let's draw this. Let's draw this with ellipse. So with an ellipse shape. So ellipse here basically indicates an attribute. Okay. Anything else that is missing here or incorrect? I think someone else suggested something else. One error found may be curly spaces of the property not mentioned yet. I think we have captured that. That's correct. So what else is incorrect here? Okay, rental agreement with tenant. Rental agreement with tenant. So what is wrong with that? Rental agreement with tenant. Okay, anything wrong here? So anything wrong between this? Oops. Do you see anything wrong here? So rent agreement. So in this case, this is a tick line. So what does a tick line mean? What does a tick line mean? A tick line means at least one. That's correct. In this case, rental agreement includes at least one tenant, and a tenant is included in at least one rental agreement, because if you look at this is a tick line on both sides, right? So the way we read this is rental agreement includes at least one tenant, and a tenant is included in at least one rental agreement. So anything you see any, is that a mistake? So which sentence talks about rental agreement and a tenant? So I think the 1, 2, 3, 4, the fourth sentence says a rental agreement details the weekly rent that is agreed upon with one or more tenant for a property for a given period of time. So basically we know that rental agreements can have one or more tenants, right? So that means a rental agreement here can include at least one. So include at least one tenant. So that means, yeah, so that's correct. So it has to have at least one tenant. It can be more. So the other way around, when we read from tenant to rental agreement, a tenant is included in one or more rental agreement. So it is possible that a tenant rents multiple places, right? So it means that the same tenant can be included in multiple, or, you know, one, at least one, but can be included in many rental agreements. So there's nothing wrong with that, because I can't see anything that says, you know, the tenant cannot be included in many rental agreements. So it is quite possible a tenant, you know, may have rented multiple places, or even for the same place, but could be multiple agreements. So that's not a problem. So between rent agreement and has. So rent agreement and has. Rent agreement and has. Okay, so here, is this a problem here? So how do we read this? This is a tick line again. So rent agreement is a tick line, and then this one has, relationship is has, and property. So how do we read this? A rental agreement has at least one property, right? Is that correct or incorrect? Is that correct or incorrect? So a rental agreement has at least one property. So that means it can have multiple properties in one rental agreement. Is it possible for a rental agreement to have more than one property? Yep, it should be only one property. That's correct. A rental agreement should only have exactly one property, right? Because if we read the fourth sentence, a rental agreement details the weekly rent that is agreed upon with one or more tenants for one property, or for a property. Okay, so that means one rental agreement only for exactly one property. So what what sign do we need to use here? Yeah, we need to add an arrow here, right? So in this case, we need an arrow. So it's still going to be a tick line, but it needs to have arrow. Okay. So arrow here indicates that exactly one. Exactly one. Okay. It's a tick arrow. If it's a thin arrow, what does that mean? If it's a thin arrow, what does that mean? So thick arrow means exactly one, but what about a thin arrow? What does a thin arrow mean? Anyone? Yeah, thin arrow means at most one. That's right. So that means it can be 0. It can also be 1. So that's what at most one means. Okay. All right. Is there any other mistakes? Is there any other mistake you can spot? Can you spot any other mistakes? So what about this one here? Property receive management. So in this case, we are saying property receive exactly one management, where is its management is provided by exactly one staff member. Is that correct? Is that correct for us to say property receive exactly one management? Can it be managed by multiple management? Yep, it should be at least one. That's correct. That means this one here, it shouldn't be an arrow, right? It should just be a tick line. So we need to remove the arrow sign here. Okay. So that arrow sign there is incorrect. So it just be a tick line to say a property receive at least one management, where each management is provided by exactly one staff member. Okay. A tick line, yeah, that's right. Okay. Can you find or spot the last mistake? What is the last mistake we can spot here? There's actually one more mistake we need to find in this model. And the last one might be a bit tricky to find because it's probably not as obvious as the other three. So the last one might be a bit hard to spot. So the last one is actually related to is a hierarchy. So is a hierarchy or inheritance, right? So we have generalization. In this case, we have a person here, a person entity, which is a generalization. And a person in this case can be is a staff, or is a landlord, or is a tenant, right? So basically a person can be one of these three objects or entities. So a person can be a staff or a landlord or a tenant. So where is the mistake? What is the problem with this is a hierarchy? Yeah, so look at this. So what does this mean? So this is actually the default. The default is just a thin line. Okay. Default is just a thin line. And what does a thin line mean? If we use a thin line in the is a hierarchy, what does that mean? Is this overlapping? So overlapping. Okay. So that's the default. What is the other default? So there are two constraints, right? So covering constraints and the overlapping constraints. So let's have a look. So overlap constraints and covering constraints. So there are two different types of constraints for an essay hierarchy. So one is the overlap constraint. So it can be disjoint or overlapping. Overlapping is the default. The other one is covering constraint, can be total or partial. Partial is the default. In this case is overlapping and partial, right? Because this is the default. Overlapping and partial. And what does this mean? So overlapping means this entity here can overlaps, right? So that means a person can be a staff member, can also be a landlord at the same time, and can also be a tenant at the same time. So if I'm a person, I can be the staff, I can also be the landlord, I can also be the tenant. So that's what overlapping means. And what does partial mean? So partial means that I, as a person, I can be an entity or an object outside of these three. Okay, so I don't have to be any of these three. So staff member, I don't have to be a staff member, I don't have to be a landlord, and I don't have to be a tenant. So that's what partial means. So should this be partial or should this be total? So if we use total, so total means we use a tick line here instead of a thin line. So if we use total, so what that means is I as a person, I have to be one of these three. I can only be one of these three. I can only be a staff or a landlord or a tenant. I cannot be anyone else outside of these three. But if I use partial, that means I can be a person besides any of these three. So that means, for example, I can be a student, which is not in this diagram, which is not in this model at the moment, right? I can be a lecturer, for example. So which one is right? Partial or total in this case? Yep, it should be total, right? It shouldn't be partial. So the other mistake is this one. So this should be a thick line instead of a thin line. Okay. The reason we want this to be a thick line, so we can make sure that this person can only be one of these three. Given that this is a real estate company, right? It doesn't make sense, for example, for a person to be a lecturer or to be a student, because a student or a lecturer is not really part of a real estate company. The real estate company only considers or is only interested on staff member, landlord, and tenant. So in a real estate company, we don't really have a lecturer, for example. In this case, using total is more appropriate than using partial. So that's the question you need to ask, right? When we have the option between the two, which one is more appropriate? Should we use partial or should we use total? In this case, using total is more appropriate because this is about a real estate company. The system captures about, is only interested about, I guess, the different person roles appropriate for a real estate company, which is in this case a staff or a landlord or a tenant. We're not interested in a lecturer, we're not interested in something else, or a student, or we're not interested in anything other than these three, basically. That's why we should be using total instead of partial. So what about disjoint? What does disjoint mean? Can anyone tell me what disjoint means? So overlapping versus disjoint. So what does disjoint mean in this case? So overlapping, I can overlap, right? So that means I can, as a person, I can play a role as multiple of these three. So I can be a staff and a landlord and a tenant all at the same time. So I can be just a landlord and a tenant at the same time. Whereas disjoint, what that means is I can only be a staff member or a landlord only or a tenant only. So I cannot overlap basically. So if you say disjoint, that means you cannot belong to more than one lower level entity set. So that means as a person, I cannot be a staff member and a landlord at the same time, for example, or I cannot be a landlord and a tenant at the same time. And I cannot be all of these three at the same time. I can only be basically one of these three only. I can be a staff member only, or a landlord only, or a tenant only. So basically, if I'm a tenant, I cannot be a landlord, and I cannot be a staff as well. So which one is more appropriate in this case? Overlapping or disjoint? So if I'm a landlord, can I be a tenant or can I be a staff? Yes. So I think the answer is yes. Because the answer is yes, that means overlapping is more appropriate, right? Rather than disjoint. So that means this is already correct. It's already using the correct constraint. So it's using overlapping. If it's disjoint, then we have to, if you want to use disjoint, then you have to put a notation here next to the line saying that this is actually disjoint. But in this case, we don't want that, right? We want this to be overlapping, so we don't have to add anything. We don't have to add any notation. So in this case, overlapping is more appropriate to use than disjoint because as a person, I can be a staff, so I can work there in the real estate company, and at the same time, I may own a property which I'm renting to this real estate company. So that is a possible use case, right? I can be both a landlord and a staff working in this real estate company at the same time. Yep. So in this case, overlapping is definitely more appropriate unless the story explicitly says that you cannot overlap. I guess as a person, as a landlord, you cannot be a tenant and a staff at the same time. But in this case, if you read through the story doesn't mention anything that a person cannot be or cannot overlap. A person cannot be a tenant and a staff at the same time. The story doesn't mention that at all. So in this case, overlapping is more appropriate than disjoint. Okay. So hopefully that helps you with your understanding. So hopefully you understand why we should be using overlapping and total. Okay. We don't want to use partial here. So we want to use overlapping and total. All right. Any questions about the first exercise? Okay, so let's move on to the second exercise. Let me just clear my drawings. So let's have a look at the second exercise. So the second exercise is a task that requires us to model an ER diagram. So in this case, we are still given a story or a scenario, and based on this story, we will need to create an ER diagram. So we need to come up with an ER model. So we need to model an entity relationship diagram based on the story that is given to us. And this story is about, what is the story about? The story is about student recreational skiing society. Okay. So maybe have a read first before we try and solve this together, okay? So how is asking for the agreement? So it means tenant can be thin, thick, arrow, whatever, because it didn't mention. So let's go back here. So the rest of you can please read the story for exercise 3. So while I'm Trying to see. Go back here to the second question. So first question, for the agreement, it means the tenant can be thick, thin arrow, whatsoever. So which one are you referring to? Is this between the tenant, rental agreement and property, or is this between rental agreement and tenant? This has been rental agreement and tenant, right? Well, in this case, this is already a thick arrow. Sorry, this is already a thick line between rent agreement and tenant, which means that a rent agreement includes one or more tenants. Or the right side of includes. Okay, so this one here. Yeah, so this one here, a tenant is included in one or more rental agreement. Yeah, in this case, it doesn't mention, you're right, it's not explicitly specified in the story that a tenant must be included in, let's say, zero agreement. So I guess it won't be a tenant if it doesn't make sense to use zero. What I'm trying to say, if you use a thin line, what that means is a tenant is included in zero agreement, and that probably doesn't make sense to use a thin line, because as soon as you are a tenant, that means you must be included in an agreement, right? In a rental agreement. For you to be a tenant, you have to be included in an agreement. So that means you have to be using at least one, right? At least one in this case. So you can't use just a thin line, because if you use a thin line, that means a tenant is included in zero or more rental agreement. It doesn't make sense for a tenant to be included in no agreement or in zero agreement. Okay. So if you're a tenant, that means you must be included in at least one agreement. And also we cannot use an arrow here. Okay. Because if you use an arrow, that means a tenant can only be included in exactly one agreement. And that is also not correct, right? Because I may rent multiple properties or more than one properties with this real estate company. So I may rent two or three different properties. So in this case, I may be included in multiple rental agreements. So using arrow, thick arrow, is also not quite right. So the most appropriate one is definitely the thick line. Okay. All right, let's look at our story for exercise 2. Okay, we want to try to finish this at least 5 minutes before 9 o'clock. So at least we can spend the last 5 minutes for all of you to try to connect to the school PostgreSQL database. So that's actually exercise 3, where all of you should have should already be set up with a database name and your username as well. So this, you should already been set up, and we will try to use your account to connect to PostgreSQL database, the university's PostgreSQL database. Okay, so that's what we will do in the third exercise. But before we go to that, let's spend 15 minutes on exercise 2, and then the last 5 minutes we'll do exercise 3. All right, have a read. It's quite a long read. So maybe we can quickly read this together. So this is about information systems. It's aimed to assist student recreational skiing society, which needs to deal with members and organize events for members. Okay, so about a system dealing with members and organizing events for members. Okay, so at the moment the system is paper-based, so there's no system today. It's basically all recorded in paper. But in the future, it's hoped to develop a computer-based system. Okay. All right, so let's have a read again. Let's follow on and read. So the society secretary uses the system to record information when a new member joins the society. Okay, so we want to use the system to record when a new member joins the society. And this information includes member name, address, vacation address, phone number, email, and it also captures the different varieties of skiing in which they're interested. Okay, so what are the different varieties of skiing? For example, Peter Williams have interest in beginners cross country, intermediate downhill, and expert bobsled. So these are the different varieties of skiing, right? That a member can be interested in. So it could be beginners cross country, intermediate downhill, or expert bobsled. These are just the different types of varieties of skiing. So member can join for one winter season by paying a fee. And then at the end of that time, of that period, the membership can be extended by paying another fee. Okay. Or they can also join for a longer period. So they can just join for one season, but they can also join for multiple periods or longer periods. If they join for longer periods, then they get fee reduced, okay, compared to paying one season one by one. Okay. So the event manager uses the system to create a ski trip, which occurs at a particular period between 4th October and 6th October inclusive, including accommodation at a particular address, and has one or more sessions of various varieties of skiing located on a different or a particular area of ski slope. Okay. So look at this. One meeting can involve 3 sessions of intermediate downhill held on piece X, Y, and Z respectively. Okay. So in this case, the meeting is actually a trip, right? So an event manager uses the system to organize a trip, right? Organize a trip, in this case, to organize the meeting, right? And the meeting can involve 3 sessions of intermediate downhill held on different locations. Okay, this piece X, Y, and Z, and 1 session of beginners downhill. Okay, so basically it could be 1 session of, or 3 sessions of intermediate downhill, and 1 session of beginners downhill held on piece X. All right, so event manager schedules its session with the appropriate number of participants from among the members who are interested in that variety of skiing. Okay, so the cost of a meeting or the trip depends on the number of members and how many sessions, number of sessions, and the variety of each session. Okay, because each session requires booking an appropriate area of ski slope. Okay, so when Bo is asking, is information an entity? Okay, let's have a look into that later. So let's finish our reading. Okay, the club treasurer uses the system to obtain reports on the total cost of the trips held during its season, and the total fee income from membership for that season. Okay, so it's a bit of a long read, yeah. So I think the trick or the tips here, the tips from me is try to make sure you understand what the story is trying to tell you. And at the same time, you have to start thinking, right? If you are to develop a database based on this story, you got to think what sort of information you need to capture. What sort of, what do you want to capture in your database, right? In this case, we need to develop an ER model. So the entities, so that's probably the first thing we want to start identifying. What sort of entities do we need to have here? And then from the entities, then we need to start identifying what are the different relationships we need to have between these different entities. And we also need to start thinking for each of these entities, what are the various attributes, what are the different attributes that identify this entity, right? So I think the most obvious one, obviously, member, right? A member will have name, address, phone number, so on and so forth. That's probably one of the more, probably the obvious one. We can tell straight away that that one is definitely going to be an entity, and that entity will have those many attributes. Okay, some of them might not be that obvious. So this is where you need to read this again and again, right? And you have to start asking yourself as to, do we need to capture this in our database? Do we need this information captured? If we need this information captured, what do we capture this as? Do we capture this as an entity? Do we capture this as a relationship? Or do we capture this as an attribute of an entity? So these are kind of questions you have to start thinking, right? It might be tricky. I guess it might not be that obvious at the beginning, but I guess as you practice more and more, I think you should get it. Okay. Okay. So Sheila is asking, will we have an answer of this exercise too? Yes, you will have the answer. You will have the answer for this exercise too, and I will probably show you as well towards the just before the end of this tutorial. I'll show you the answer to, I guess, one sample answer to this exercise. And usually, typically, although there may be, I guess, the sample answers of the just one option for you to model this ER diagram, an ER diagram based on the story, but there might be other correct answers. So there might be multiple correct answers, I guess, to the story. What really matters is to make sure that the model, your ER model, reflects the story as accurate as possible. Okay. So if a member, let's say, have 5 attributes or 6 attributes, make sure you stick to that. Okay, make sure you stick to the story, because if it's not explicitly mentioned in the story, then either you don't include on your ER diagram. I guess if you include in your ER diagram, then you have to state your assumption. Okay. So the reason I say this is important because your first assignment is going to be something similar to this question, where you will be given a story, and based on the story, you have to model an entity relationship diagram. Okay, so this exercise 2 here that we are doing will be quite similar to your assignment 1. Okay, so I guess, as I said, first thing first is to identify the entities, right? That's probably the very first thing we want to do here. What are the entities that, I guess, what are the various entities we need to have here? What do you think feels right to model as an entity? So as I said earlier, the most obvious one is member, right? Because the system needs to capture information about member. So that's obviously, I think that's probably the most obvious. Hopefully everyone gets that. And you can see here as well, member will have the various attributes. So these are all attributes of a member name, term time address, vacation address, phone number. These are all attributes that describe member entity, right? Email, and what about these different varieties of skiing that in which they're interested in? So what is this? Is this an attribute, or is this something else? How do we model different varieties of skiing that a member are interested in? So there's an example here. Peter Williams, as a member, may have interest in multiple different varieties of skiing, right? Beginner cross country, intermediate downhill, and expert bobsled. So this person has 3 different interests in 3 different varieties of skiing that the person is interested in. Okay. Period. Okay, so do we need to capture period? So members join for a period of 1 winter season. Yep, so period, we need to capture that because we need to track this member joins when, right? When does this member join? What season is this member joining, right? So we need to track that, right? We need to know what season is this member joining for. Is this member joining for for 1 season only, or for multiple, or for longer periods or multiple seasons, right? So we need to know that, right? So if a member only joins for 1 period or for 1 season, then we need to know that. Or a member can join for a longer period, right? And if it's joining, I guess if a member joins for a longer period, and that longer period potentially can consist of multiple seasons, right? So I may join in winter season only, but another member can join for, I guess, autumn and winter, for example, 2 seasons at the same time. That's for a longer period. It's possible, right? It's possible for a member to join for multiple periods, multiple seasons. So yes, we need a way to track periods that the member joins for. What else do we need to capture? I think someone mentioned about secretary, society secretary. So do we really need to capture secretary? Society secretary. Do we need this in our system? Do we need to record information or track information about society secretary? Yep. The answer is no. So if the answer is no, then we don't really need society secretary as an entity. Okay. I think someone mentioned something else. Event manager. Do we need to capture information about event manager? So event manager again uses the system. But do we need to model event manager? Do we need to capture this as an entity? In this case, event manager is just a user, right? A user of the system. But do we really need to model this as an entity? That's the question we need to ask. Similar to society secretary, right? Do we really need to model event manager as an entity? What do you think? So the answer is again no, right? We don't really need to model event manager. So the event manager is just a user of the system. We don't really need to model this or track this in our system, right? So a few other things, I suppose you can let me just clear my screen. So the ski trip, we will need to track the ski trip, right? Because the ski trip occurs over a period, and the ski trip also has accommodation, right? So we need to track the ski trip because the system is used to capture information about ski trip or ski meeting, right? Because in this case, a meeting can involve 3 sessions of intermediate downhill held at piece X, piece Y, piece Z. So we need to track this information. So definitely we will need an entity tracking, an entity for ski trip or meeting. And then there's also session. So what is the meeting is about, right? Because a meeting can have multiple sessions of multiple variety, for example, right? So it could be 3 sessions of this variety, or could be just 1 session of this variety, of this beginner's downhill variety. Okay. And accommodation, potentially we need to track that as well. Yep. And we need to probably know the fee. Okay. For example, the cost of a meeting, right? We need to know how much it costs, how much that meeting costs. And yeah, so the meeting obviously will have the start date and maybe the end date. In this case, from 4th of October to 6th of October. And this one, piece X, piece Y is actually a ski slope, right? So this is the different ski slope. And so there could be multiple ski slopes, X, Y, and Z. So that's just the different ski slopes. So I think we've captured pretty much almost all or almost everything. So let's have a look at the sample answer. So this is, as I said, a sample answer, but by no means not the only answer. There may be some other correct answer. So don't worry if you don't manage to get, to record this answer, because the solution will be provided to you. So this sample solution will be given to you, and you can have a look and try to understand, review the answer, and see if you understand this. So you can see here there's a member subscribes to period, joining period. Okay. And then the joining period may include seasons, right? And as I mentioned, it may include one or more session, right? It's possible that a member joins for two seasons, autumn and winter, for example, or just winter only, or one season only, right? So member interested in variety. So this is the intermediate downhill, expert bobsled. So those are just different varieties, really. And you can see we have a meeting or ski trip. Ski trip consists of multiple sessions where each session can have a type of variety and also occurs at different ski slope, right? So the ski slope could be piece X, Y, or Z. And then you can see here as well, a meeting is hosted at an accommodation. Okay, because the system is used to hold an event, right? Hold a meeting or organize a ski trip. So this is why we need to capture information about the meeting or about the ski trip. So we have meeting, session, accommodation, ski slope, and then this is the variety where the member might be interested in. And the session that is organized for the meeting also has a type of the variety. Okay, so hopefully you get the gist of this. And as I said, please review the sample solution. You may come up with a different solution. That's totally fine. As I said, this is just one sample. By no means it's not the only correct answer. There may be other correct answers as well. So the key is, as long as your ER models captures the story here as accurate as possible, you want to try to model something that is as accurate or reflects the story as accurate as possible. So that's the key, right? As long as you try to model this as accurately as possible, then you should be okay. Any questions about ER diagram creation? I know I'm going a bit fast because we have a few minutes left, and we need to probably try exercise 3 as well, because I want to make sure that all of you can access the school PostgreSQL database server. So don't worry if you have difficulties understanding some of these. As I said, please use your spare time to read through the story again and then go back to the sample solution to see if you understand how this model, the model that is given to you as a sample solution, reflects the story here. Okay. All right, exercise 3, the last one. So let's set up PostgreSQL account. Okay. So first thing first you need to do is you have to make sure that you you have installed VPN, right? It's important that you have VPN installed on your computers. So this is the VPN. You can see my screen. So I got Cisco AnyConnect Secure Mobility Client. So if you have not installed this, go to this link here. Go to this link here. Okay. So if I read, you can install a software, and the VPN will allow you to securely connect to the university network. So before you connect to your database sitting in the university school database, PostgreSQL database server, you have to first install VPN software and then put the address here as the VPN address that you're connecting to, vpn.sydney.edu. So this is the university VPN address that you need to use. Okay. And then you click connect. You can see here it's trying to connect. So it asks me to, okay, so it will actually go to this login page, university login page, where you will be asked to use your unique and password to log in. Okay, so obviously I will log in. Okay, I am now connected. You can see here that I'm connected. See, you have to make sure that the VPN software here says connected to vpn.sydney.edu.au. So this means you are now connected. Once you're connected, then you can open your pgadmin. Okay, pgadmin. So you should all have installed pgadmin tools from week 1, from last week. So open this up. So that VPN basically allows us to securely connect to the university network, as I said. And then enter your master password if your database has a master password. Okay, so I am now on pgadmin 4. You can see here I got 2 database servers. So I actually created this second one earlier using the settings given on this tutorial handout. So please use this setting when you create a server. Use this as the host. Database name is this. Okay. Make sure you change this word unique key with your own unique key, right? Whatever your unique key is, you have to use your own unique key. Same thing with the username. Make sure you replace this word, the word here, unique key, with your own unique key. Okay. And then the password is actually your student ID. Your student ID is, I think, the 10-digit student ID, right? Whatever your student ID is. Make sure you use that. Okay. Use your own, don't use someone else's. And so that's the details you need to enter in these details. So I can actually show you here properties. So I created this new server. So under connection, you can see here that I'm using this host. Leave the port number as is. So this is my database and username. You can see here. In your case, you should use your unique key, right? Remember, this one should be your unique key. Do not use mine, okay? So the username and database should be the same. And then under advanced, so if you click to the advanced tab, the database restriction, you should make sure you also include your own database as the database restriction, right? So this is my own database. Make sure you basically use the same one here and add that to this database restriction. If you don't do this, if you don't have this in your database restriction, you will end up seeing other people's databases as well. You're gonna end up with a lot of databases. You're gonna be able to look at other people's databases as well, which is not what you want. You just want to restrict these to your own database. You don't want to view any other people's or other students' databases, including my one. Okay. Obviously, make sure you also add your password or punch in your password. Your password is your student ID, as I said. Okay, so remember this DB restriction is important, okay? Because otherwise you'll get to see other people's databases, which is not what you want. Once you have that set up, you can just click on your servers and, okay, so it's asking for password. I enter my password. All right, so you can see here that I am now connected to the university's database server. So I'm connected now to PostgreSQL sitting on the university servers. Okay. And I can start typing queries. I can just click, choose query tool. I can start writing SQL queries here if I want to. Let's say let's check for the version of the PostgreSQL database server run at the school servers. Just select version. I'll just run this. So you can see here that the school is running PostgreSQL 9.5.1, okay, on Linux, on PC Linux, okay. So it's running Red Hat Linux, 64 bits, and it's running PostgreSQL servers. PostgreSQL Server version 9.5.1. Yes, it is a bit outdated, but this is the version that we will be using for this course. So any of your assignments, you have to make sure that it is runnable. You can run it on. So if you have to write scripts, for example, for your assignment or anything else, even for your tutorials as well, we will be executing the scripts, those scripts, your database scripts against the school database servers. Okay. So that's it. Actually, that's the end of the tutorial. I think the last bit of this exercise actually asks you to change your password. Okay, so make sure you execute this command and change your password to a new password. So this uses a single quote, okay, a single quote, and then followed by the new password that you want to use, and make sure you use a password that you remember. Okay. If you forgot your new password, in the coming weeks, I will not be able to help you reset your password. So once you create, or I guess change your password to a new password, you have to remember that new password, because I will not be able to reset your password. Okay. If you want to reset your password, you have to contact the school officer, the school admin officer, to help you reset your password if you forgot your password. Okay. So that's why I want to make sure if you change your password in step 7 here, make sure you remember your new password. So that's why choose something that you remember. Okay. I think it says here as well, please remember your new password because you will need this later in the course. Okay. And I will not be able to reset your password, as I said. Okay. So if you ask me next week or in 2 weeks or in 3 weeks time, say, oh, I forgot my password, can you please help me? I will not be able to help. You have to contact the admin officer, the school admin officer, to help you reset your password. Because I don't have admin access to reset anyone's password. Okay. So that's actually it for today. We are slightly over time, but that's okay. And I actually need to run to another meeting. So if you guys have any question, please post your questions on it, and I should be able to help any problems or any issues that you have. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night. I'll look forward to speaking with you all again next week. Thank you all.